Although there were countless omissions and adjustments made when A Song of Ice and Fire was adapted for the screen in Game of Thrones, one of the biggest focal points for change, in the eyes of fans and even the author himself, is the conspicuous absence of Lady Stoneheart. Of course, while every alteration has an effect on the overall story, the changes that George R.R. Martin publicly disagrees with seems like they must be of particular importance. Given how much of the TV series that he actually hasn't criticized, the fact that he has consistently brought up Game of Thrones cutting out Lady Stoneheart as one of his least favorite diversions from his own story makes it obvious that in his eyes, she's a very important character who will have a significant impact on the novels in some way. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss explain that their decision to abandon Lady Stoneheart was actually driven by the future resurrection of Jon Snow. Since they knew that was coming in the future, they didn't want to offer too many hints that it was going to happen. Clearly, in retrospect, their decisions to omit massive developments, characters, and storylines in the name of keeping things shocking really bit them in the ass. But considering that other characters like young Griff were also never translated to the screen, despite their seemingly huge importance to the bigger plot beats of the overall narrative, it's incredibly telling that George R.R. Martin is still exceptionally stuck on Lady Stoneheart's absence, especially since she hasn't done anything massively influential in the books as of yet. It seems safe to assume that whatever is going to happen, she's going to have a significant impact on the story going forward. And although there are plenty of different ideas and theories regarding her role, I personally think some of the major beats of Lady Stoneheart's future aren't particularly difficult to guess. Lady Stoneheart is Catelyn Stark, reanimated by Beric Dondarrion after being pulled from the river by the direwolf Nymeria. She is now roving the Riverlands, sometimes with the Brotherhood Without Banners, in an attempt to avenge her family by killing as many Lannisters and Freys as she can find. Death has made her nearly unrecognizable in comparison to the person that Catelyn Stark once was, and her incredibly harsh notion of justice and revenge makes her a terrifying figure. The connective threads here aren't exactly subtle. Nymeria, the Riverlands, the Brotherhood Without Banners, an obsession with justice that actually seems more like brutality and a thirst for violence. It's not hard to see that Lady Stoneheart and Arya Stark are almost certainly on a collision course with one another in the future of the books. Arya has gone through a great deal on her journey since leaving King's Landing, but arguably her biggest trials and tribulations came during her journey through the Riverlands. Given that her experiences there were extremely traumatic, it would make a great deal of sense that Arya would work her way through it, literally and metaphorically, on her road back to Winterfell. In Game of Thrones, Arya's pit stop in the Riverlands was shockingly limited, even considering the fact that the episodes of the final 2 seasons seemingly crammed as much information and plot into every hour as possible. But given that even in their Cliff's Notes version of the story, they made a point of including her massacring the Freys, meeting with Nymeria and her super pack of wolves, reconnecting with Hot Pie at the inn at the crossroads, and deciding between returning to King's Landing to get revenge on the Lannisters versus going home to Winterfell and House Stark, it seems obvious that there's a very significant storyline awaiting Arya Stark in the Riverlands in A Song of Ice and Fire. Out of all of the events that take place during this brief arc for Arya in Game of Thrones, the most significant seems to be her complete elimination of House Frey. It's both significant because it directly aligns with one of Lady Stoneheart's goals, and because of what it should but ultimately doesn't mean to Arya's arc as a character. The TV series obviously oversimplifies a great deal of the novel story, but one of their biggest and most consistent flaws in terms of characterization is the fact that they portray nearly every character's brutal murders as pure badassery, rather than the sign of horrific trauma that it often is. Characters killing their enemies is supposed to make them strong and clever and cool, and the show almost never acknowledges or portrays the fact that these people who are barely older than children aren't engaging in gruesome violence as a show of strength, but as a show of trauma. This is a problem for many characters, but it's arguably the biggest problem for Arya. Both because her over-the-top brutality becomes a major facet of her cool girl persona on the show, and because Game of Thrones never actually addresses how disturbing Arya's behavior is. The most resolution Arya really gets around her quest to become a metaphorical sword of vengeance comes in her final conversation with the Hound. But George R.R. Martin's presentation of Arya is drastically different. Yes, she's training to be an assassin, and yes, within her own mind, she does seem to be getting a certain satisfaction out of killing people. However, many of Arya's behaviors and reactions in the books are pretty clear indications that she's suffering with some severe PTSD, and her actions are supposed to be unsettling rather than inspiring. Obviously, George R.R. Martin didn't write about a tween becoming a serial killer because he wanted the reader to walk away with the impression that being a serial killer is really cool. And although the Hound is undoubtedly an important player in Arya's character arc, in both the books and the TV series, it seems safe to assume that him posing a simple question to her about how much it sucks to get consumed by revenge is not going to be the climax of her internal struggle. Ultimately, one of the biggest tragedies of Arya's character arc in Game of Thrones is that it essentially became meaningless towards the end. Yes, she certainly had more than enough to do in order to drive the larger plot forward, but her internal and individual storyline wasn't particularly significant or coherent. And the absence of Lady Stoneheart and her entire storyline is probably why that is. I think that in all likelihood, the book version of this storyline is going to be significantly longer, and that Game of Thrones probably just included the most necessary plot beats in order to get it over with and get Arya back to Winterfell. But I think she will return to the Riverlands and reunite with Lady Stoneheart, and together they will eliminate House Frey. Arya will likely be initially happy to be reunited with the revenant of her mother, and will be more than pleased to take revenge on the Freys. But ultimately, both of these experiences will result in an internal crisis for Arya. Ironically, she'll probably come to the same conclusion about both Lady Stoneheart and massacring the Freys. That getting everything that she has been fantasizing about for years isn't all that she hoped it would be. And that these ideas that have admittedly kept her alive in many instances are also ultimately empty illusions. It comes as no surprise that Game of Thrones would omit many minor characters in their adaptation of the books. But one of the most interesting and important facets of the story that they wind up missing is that the Freys are not all created equal. The inclusion of characters like Olyvar, Roslyn, and even Big and Little Walder seem to subtly illustrate that, despite the horrific acts of House Frey as a whole, not all of them are equally guilty, and some of them aren't guilty at all. Therefore, Arya's wholesale slaughter of the entire family shouldn't be a particularly inspiring or thrilling moment in the TV series. Or at the very least, it should elicit a much more conflicted reaction than it does. Arya assassinating the entire family, doling out identical punishments, and essentially reenacting her own version of the Red Wedding is actually a profoundly disturbing moment for her character. Or at least, it should be. George R.R. Martin obviously tackles different situations in different ways. But one pretty consistent element of the story at large is that pulling the classic Tywin Lannister move of utterly obliterating entire groups for transgressions against you is a choice that can never lead anywhere good in the end. And although Tywin is the best example of it, this concept is one that is repeated quite a few times throughout the novels. So to expect that killing every single Frey would be any different just because the Starks are the ones doing the killing is unreasonable. And the fact that Arya suffers absolutely no internal or external consequences for her actions in Game of Thrones doesn't really make sense. Arya's sense of right and wrong is completely warped beyond recognition at present in the books. But I think her second sojourn in the Riverlands is likely going to be the moment where she realizes that abject cruelty and revenge never leads anyone anywhere. The scene that she has with the Hound in the penultimate episode of the series was likely meant to come much earlier on in the story, because going from a bloodthirsty assassin to a hero fighting for the good of the people isn't some internal switch that can be flipped in 5 minutes. And obviously, if the start of this life lesson comes with Arya's reunion with Catelyn, it'll be far more meaningful than some improvised insight from Sandor Clegane. I agree with the fairly popular fan theory that Arya will come to realize that Lady Stoneheart is just the darkest shadow of the person that Catelyn Stark truly was. And she'll mercy kill her, not only to release Catelyn from this prison, but also to protect the world from the at least partially undeserved wrath that Lady Stoneheart longs for. And once she has let go of the ghost of her mother, and the notion that killing is the only thing that will make things better, she'll return to Winterfell. I think a good portion of the Game of Thrones storyline will actually match up with the A Song of Ice and Fire plot as well. I think that Arya will reunite with some of her siblings, and they will defeat Littlefinger before facing the threat of the White Walkers. And then once again, I think her story is going to pretty drastically divert from the TV version of her arc. Given that the Night King and Arya's role in his destruction was an admitted TV show invention, I think that Arya's entire story is most likely leading towards her being the one to kill Daenerys in the end, not Jon. Arya and Dany are fantastic foils to one another in so many ways. And ironically, their paths also seem to be dark mirrors of each other's as well. It's fascinating, because in their own minds, Arya and Dany have a great deal in common. A hugely motivating factor for them becoming more powerful and more deadly is that they want to return to Westeros and avenge their families. And it's hard to believe that this is a coincidence that isn't leading anywhere significant. If Arya's experience in the Riverlands teaches her that getting so-called revenge against people that you don't know, who may or may not be responsible for the sufferings of you and your family, in the most violent and brutal way possible, is actually not a good thing, then obviously that would position her directly against Daenerys. Unless Dany also has some sort of come-to-Jesus moment about maybe not setting the people you believe deserve your wrath aflame. One of the key aspects of the titular Game of Thrones that Game of Thrones mostly lost sight of was the truism that when the High Lords of Westeros come into conflict, it's always the common people who suffer. Dany massacring King's Landing out of some misguided sense of revenge for House Targaryen's deposition is obviously the biggest and best example of that. But Lady Stoneheart's willingness to brutalize and murder the innocent, just in the hopes of getting her vengeance, and her willingness to judge all those who don't devote themselves to the cause of revenge for House Stark as guilty, seems to be a pretty perfect microcosm of Dany's, and in many ways Arya's, current outlook on the world. George R.R. Martin has directly stated that Arya is one of his favorite characters, so I think that Lady Stoneheart's role is largely meant to transform Arya from the terrifying and traumatized child that she is into a genuine agent of justice who looks at the world from a broader perspective rather than just her own. And given that he has repeatedly said that Lady Stoneheart's omission from Game of Thrones was a huge issue for him, I think it makes a lot of sense that her storyline with Arya will alter Arya's entire trajectory as a character, and likely leave her on a collision course with Dany. Lady Stoneheart's existence is fascinating, but at present, her importance to the story overall doesn't seem cataclysmic. But again, given George R.R. Martin's fixation on her, it seems that her presence and character arc will likely have an impact on the climax of the entire story. And this is what makes the most sense to me from both a character development perspective and on a macro level for the total A Song of Ice and Fire saga. But what do you think? Was Lady Stoneheart meant to inspire Arya's rejection of brutality and violence in favor of true justice? And how did Lady Stoneheart's absence from Game of Thrones alter the series as a whole? Leave your thoughts and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.